The ink on my divorce decree wasn't even dry when I stood on the humid Savannah courthouse steps. I'm Annette, 42, a veteran logistics manager. My ex-husband thought his high society family had quietly bled our family trucking firm dry. He forgot I track every single asset. The air in Savannah during late September is like a wet wool blanket, thick with the smell of pluff, mud, and salt from the marshes. As I stood outside the heavy brass doors of the Chatham County Courthouse, the heat rushed to meet me, but for the first time in 15 years, I didn't feel suffocated by it. In my right hand, I held a manila folder containing the signed dissolution of my marriage to Julian Beaufort. In my left, I held my scratch smartphone, its screen protectors spider-webbed from a drop on the gravel lot of the Vance Logistics terminal 3 weeks ago. Julian had walked out of the courtroom 5 minutes before me, his linen suit perfectly pressed, smelling of expensive bay rum and unearned victory. He hadn't even looked back. Why would he? He thought he had taken me to the cleaners. He had walked away with the historic townhouse on Jones Street, the one my father, Arthur, had helped us put a down payment on and a hefty monthly alimony payment that his lawyer had spent 6 months badgering my legal counsel for. Julian's mother, Genevieve Beaufort, had been sitting in the gallery during the final hearing, wearing her signature ivory silk scarf and a smug, tight-lipped smile that said she had successfully raided the working-class pantry once again. The Beauforts were old Savannah names, which in this city usually means they had a massive family tree, a crumbling historic property, and absolutely no liquid cash. For generations, they had lived on reputation and the interest of trusts that had dried up before the turn of the century. When Julian married me, a girl who grew up with grease under her fingernails and a clipboard in her hand, Genevieve had nearly fainted into her sweet tea. But they quickly realized that while Vance Logistics didn't have a coat of arms, we had 62 Peterbilt rigs, a thriving regional shipping network, and a healthy cash flow. I took a deep breath, feeling the sweat start to bead at my hairline. I looked down at my phone. I knew some of you are doing this exact math at your own kitchen table right now, wondering how we let them get so close, how we let people who look down on us put their hands so deep into our pockets. If you've ever sat under the flickering fluorescent light of a back office, staring at a spreadsheet that tells you your trust was weaponized against you, you know the hollow feeling in the pit of your stomach, but you also know the cold, quiet spark that lights up when you realize they think you're too soft to strike back. I tapped the screen and dialed my father's direct line at the terminal. Arthur Vance answered on the second ring. His voice was tired, thick with the gravel of a man who had spent 40 years shouting over diesel engines, and who was now fighting a losing battle with early-onset arthritis. Annette, is it done, baby girl? It's done, Dad, I said, my voice steady, though my heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The judge signed the decree. Julian got the house. He got the alimony. I heard my father sigh, a sound that carried the weight of every mile he'd ever driven to put food on our table. I'm sorry, honey. I'm so sorry I let him squeeze us like this. I just wanted you to be happy. Don't you dare apologize, Dad, I said, looking out over the square, where Spanish moss hung from the live oaks like gray lace. Julian got exactly what he asked for, but he forgot one very important detail. He forgot that the temporary injunction protecting his special projects division expires the exact minute the divorce is finalized. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. I could picture my father sitting at his worn oak desk, surrounded by faded photos of our first single-axle trucks, a chipped ceramic mug of black coffee cooling beside his elbow. Annette, he murmured, the realization starting to dawn on him. Call Clara in HR, I said, my voice dropping to a quiet, lethal whisper. Tell her to pull up the master payroll system. I want every single one of the 27 independent regional liaisons and marketing consultants Julian onboarded over the last 3 years terminated immediately, effective this very second. Revoke their company fuel cards. Deactivate their gate codes. Delete their remote network access. If any of them have company-leased vehicles, send the repo trucks to their driveways before 5 o'clock. 27 of them, my dad muttered, a low growl beginning to form in his chest. Genevieve's whole damn country club roster. Every single one, I confirmed. And Dad? Make sure Clara sends the automated termination notices to their personal emails right now. I want the system to hit them before they even finish their late lunches. Consider it done, my father said, and for the first time in 3 years, I heard a spark of the old, fierce Arthur Vance in his voice. I'm on it, Annette. Come on home. One hung up, leaning against the warm stone column of the courthouse. My mind drifted back to how we had gotten here. 3 years ago, my mother was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. For 18 agonizing months, my world shrank to the size of a hospice room, holding her frail hand, listening to the rhythmic hum of the oxygen machine and trying to keep her comfortable. My father was wrecked, spending every spare minute sitting in the vinyl chair beside her bed, unable to focus on the daily operations of the company he had built from a single-used dump truck. During that time, I had to step back from the day-to-day oversight of Vance Logistics. Julian, who had been serving as our nominal VP of Business Development, a title we gave him so he wouldn't feel emasculated when we attended local business. Dinners magnanimously offered to take the administrative burden off our shoulders. He was so gentle about it. He brought my mother lilies. He kissed my forehead and told me to focus on being a daughter while he handled the boring paperwork. I was so exhausted, so blinded by grief, that I handed him the keys to the kingdom. I approved his request to upgrade our HR and payroll software to a cloud-based system he claimed would streamline operations. It wasn't until 3 months after my mother's funeral, when the fog of grief finally began to lift and I returned to my desk, that I noticed the bleed. I was reviewing our quarterly operating expenses when I saw a massive spike in the specialized regional outreach budget. When I asked Clara, our loyal office manager who had been with us since I was in middle school, she looked at me with tear-filled eyes. Clara was a woman who lived in faded denim shirts, her gray hair held back by plastic claws, and she loved my family like her own. Annette, I tried to ask Julian about it, Clara had whispered to me in the break room, her hands trembling as she held her mug. But he told me it was a confidential expansion project approved by your father. He said if I kept digging, he'd have to restructure my position right out of the budget. I was scared, honey. Your dad was so broken up over your mama, I didn't want to add to his troubles. When Clara handed me the hidden ledger she had kept on a personal thumb drive, my blood ran cold. Julian, under the heavy-handed direction of his mother, Genevieve, had turned Vance Logistics into a private welfare state for the Beaufort clan and their associates. There was Julian's cousin, Archibald, who was listed as a coastal logistics strategist earning $85,000 a year plus a company truck. Despite living full-time in a beach condo in Hilton Head and having 3 prior DUIs, there was Genevieve's personal tennis coach, listed as a wellness consultant. There were nieces, nephews, failing business partners of Julian's father, and even 2 of Genevieve's bridge partners, all classified as independent community liaisons. 27 people in total. None of them had ever stepped foot inside our terminal. None of them had ever loaded a crate, scheduled a route, or done a single day's honest work. They were ghost employees, siphoning off more than $2 million a year in salaries, health insurance, and fuel allowances from a business where our real drivers worked 60-hour weeks in the grueling heat to earn a decent living. When I confronted Julian, he didn't even deny it. He just smiled that lazy, patronizing smile of his. Annette, darling, you have to look at the bigger picture. These are influential people in the community. Their goodwill keeps the city council from looking too closely at your zoning permits. Besides, your family business makes more than enough to share the wealth. Don't be so provincial. When I told him I was filing for divorce, he laughed. He told me his family's lawyers would tie me up in court for years, and if I tried to fire his people, they would sue Vance Logistics for breach of contract and wrongful termination, using the vague, ironclad employment agreements he had signed as VP. And he was right, his lawyers managed to get a temporary court injunction freezing any changes to the Special Projects Division payroll until the divorce was finalized, claiming those positions were marital assets subject to valuation. But today, the marriage was officially dead. The injunction was gone, and the trap was sprung. I walked down the steps, the heat radiating through the soles of my sensible leather flats. I got into my dusty, mid-sized SUV, ignoring the pristine luxury sedans parked in the reserved lot, and turned the ignition. The engine rumbled to life, a comforting, mechanical sound that reminded me of who I was. As I drove back toward the industrial district near the port, my phone began to buzz in the cup holder. The first call was from an unknown number with a Hilton Head area code. Archibald, no doubt, wondering why his company gas card had just been declined at the pump. I let it go to voicemail. By the time I pulled into the gravel lot of Vance Logistics, the phone was vibrating continuously. Cousin Archibald, the tennis coach, the bridge partners, the whole parasitic ecosystem was waking up to the reality that the host organism had just grown a spine. I parked next to my dad's old Ford F-150. The smell of diesel fuel, hot asphalt, and the salt marsh washed over me as I stepped out. I walked into the metal-sided terminal building, the hum of the warehouse fans a familiar lullaby. Clara was waiting for me at the front desk, a massive grin stretching across her lined face. She held up a thick stack of printed termination confirmations. "They're hitting the fan, Annette," Clara said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "My phone has been ringing off the hook for 20 minutes. Genevieve's lawyer has already called twice, screaming about illegal retaliation." "Let them scream," I said, taking the stack of papers from her. "They don't have a contract anymore." The court ruled that Julian's employment agreements were unauthorized self-dealing. "They're done." I walked into my father's office. He was standing by the window, looking out at the yard where our drivers were pre-tripping their rigs for the evening runs. He turned to me, his eyes moist, and reached out to pull me into a tight, crushing hug. "You did it, Annette," he whispered. "You saved us." "We saved us, Dad," I corrected him, holding him tight. "But it's not over yet. Genevieve is going to realize what happened any minute now. And she isn't the type to go quietly into the night." "Let her come," my dad said, his jaw tightening. "Let her see what happens when she tries to step on a Vance." I knew he was right. Genevieve Beaufort lived for status, and the sudden loss of 27 salaries that kept her social circle afloat was going to feel like a guillotine. She would come for me, and she would come hot. But as I sat down at my desk, looking at the empty space where Julian's framed photo used to sit, I felt a deep, cool peace wash over me. The sun was beginning to dip below the tree line, casting long, amber shadows across the gravel yard. The real work was about to begin. Clara's office smelled of stale peppermint candies, industrial-grade floor cleaner, and the warm, metallic scent of a copier that had been running for 3 hours straight. It was a small, windowless room squeezed between the driver's lounge and the main dispatch floor. On the wall hung a faded calendar from 3 years ago, showing a dusty red Peterbilt parked in front of a Rocky Mountain sunset. The last calendar my mother had hung up before she got sick. "Sit down, baby," Clara said, pulling a squeaking vinyl chair toward me. She reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a small blue and white tin of butter cookies, the kind everyone's grandmother uses to store sewing supplies. Inside, instead of cookies or needles, were 3 encrypted flash drives and a set of brass keys. "We've got a lot of ground to cover before the sun goes down, and Genevieve isn't going to sit on her hands while her family's play money dries up." I sat, the vinyl sticking slightly to the back of my thighs through my trousers. The heat of the Savannah afternoon was still radiating off my skin, but inside this office, with the window unit rattling and blowing ice-cold air directly onto my neck, I felt a sudden, sharp clarity. For the past 18 months, while the divorce dragged through the Chatham County family court system, my hands had been tied. Every time I had tried to look at the books, Julian's high-priced attorneys from downtown would file another motion, claiming I was harassing their client and trying to devalue his rightful contribution to Vance Logistics. The judge, a sleepy-eyed man who went to the same country club as Julian's father, had issued a status quo order. It meant we had to keep paying the bills, keep funding the accounts, and keep our mouths shut until the final decree was signed. But they didn't realize that while I couldn't touch the payroll, I could still watch. And I had watched every single penny. I reached into my canvas tote bag and pulled out my secret weapon, a heavy olive drab canvas binder with a broken metal zipper. I had found this binder in the back of my mother's old closet, still smelling of her lavender sachet. Inside it, I hadn't kept recipes or old letters. I had kept the real, hard, undeniable truth. "Let's start with the fuel cards," I said, unzipping the binder with a sharp tug that caught on the frayed fabric. I laid out 3 yellow legal pads, each covered in my own precise, cramped handwriting. If you've ever had to sit at your kitchen table under a single light bulb, matching up receipts to see where your grocery money went while your partner spent $100 bills like they were pocket lint, you know the feeling of tracing a thief? You don't get angry at first, you just get cold. You look at the numbers and you realize that every single digit is a lie they told to your face. Clara leaned in, her reading glasses sliding down her nose. "Archibald's card is the worst," she whispered, pointing to a highlighted column. "That boy hasn't been within 50 miles of our Savannah terminal in 2 years. But look at this. He logged $3,000 in diesel fuel last month alone," I said, my finger tracing the line. "All of it charged at a marina in Hilton Head." He wasn't putting fuel into a Vance Logistics truck. He was fueling his twin-engine center console boat. He's been taking his country club buddies out deep-sea fishing on our dime while our drivers are rationing their lunch money because Julian frozen our quarterly safety bonuses. "And here," Clara said, flipping to the next page of my binder, "Lucille's expense reports." Lucille was Julian's younger sister. Her title on the payroll was Strategic Communications Coordinator. She was supposed to be handling our regional marketing and public relations. She billed us $12,000 for promotional dinners at the Pink House and Elizabeth on 37th, I said, a bitter laugh escaping my throat. I cross-referenced the dates with her public Instagram account, Clara. On June 14th, she claimed she was hosting a logistics seminar for regional shipping clients, but her Instagram showed her hosting her own engagement party, drinking champagne out of crystal flutes that Vance Logistics paid for, while my dad was driving a night route to Atlanta because we couldn't afford to hire an extra team driver. "My God, Annette," my dad said, stepping into the small office and leaning his heavy frame against the door jamb. He looked down at the yellow pads, his weathered face darkening. I knew it was bad, but I didn't know they were flaunting it like this. I trusted that boy. When he came into our family, I thought he was going to help us build something. I thought he loved you. "He loved our cash flow, Dad," I said softly, looking up at him. "And Genevieve loved having a piggy bank she didn't have to explain to her bridge partners." I felt a familiar, heavy ache in my chest. It was the vulnerability I hated to admit, even to myself. For years, I had blamed myself for not seeing through Julian earlier. I had been so busy trying to be a good daughter, a good manager, and a good wife that I had ignored the red flags. I had ignored the way Julian looked down his nose at the dirt on my dad's boots, the way Genevieve would politely decline to eat the potato salad Clara brought to our office picnics because it was too heavy. I had let them make me feel small, like my family's hard work was just a crude foundation for their elegant lifestyle. But that was over now. "We have the corporate bylaws right here," I said, pulling a stapled document from the back of the canvas binder. "This is what Marin Sterling, my attorney, found. When my father and I restructured the company 10 years ago, we put in a clause. Any employment contract or consulting agreement exceeding $50,000 annually requires the joint signatures of both the president, that's you, Dad, and the chief operating officer, which is me. Clara's eyes went wide. And Julian signed all 27 of these agreements by himself? Every single one, I said, a slow smile finally breaking across my face. He signed them as VP of Business Development, claiming he had delegated authority under the temporary administrative transfer we signed when Mom was sick. But that transfer only authorized him to manage daily operations, not to execute long-term, non-cancelable employment contracts. Under Georgia law, these 27 contracts aren't just voidable. They are void ab initio. They never legally existed. Which means, my dad said, a low rumble of satisfaction in his voice, they can't sue us for breach of contract. Because there is no contract. Exactly, I said. And because they were never legal employees. Every single dollar they took from this company under the guise of salary, benefits, and expenses can be classified as unauthorized corporate distributions. We aren't just firing them, Dad. We are preparing to file a civil recovery suit against Julian Genevieve and every single one of their little country club associates to get our $1.2 million back. The room went completely still, save for the hum of the air conditioner. Clara let out a low whistle, her face flushed with excitement. My dad just stared at me, his eyes shining with a mixture of pride and relief that made the lump in my throat grow even tighter. You really are your mother's daughter, he whispered, his voice cracking slightly. Sarah always said you had a mind like a steel trap. She used to say, Arthur, don't you ever worry about Annette? She let people think she's quiet, but when she decides to move, she moves mountains. I reached out and took my dad's rough, calloused hand, squeezing it tight. I learned it from both of you, Dad. You built this company with your sweat. I'm not going to let them turn it into a charity for people who wouldn't even wave to us on the street. Suddenly, the landline on Clara's desk let out a shrill, piercing ring. We all jumped slightly. Clara looked at the caller ID and her smile faded. She looked up at me, her eyes wide. It's the main line. It's Genevieve Beaufort's personal cell phone. I looked at the blinking red light on the phone. I knew what was coming. The automated termination emails had been sent 30 minutes ago. The fuel cards had been deactivated. The remote access codes had been wiped from the server. The country club crowd was currently realizing that their free ride had just hit a brick wall, and the Queen Mother of Savannah Society was about to demand answers. Don't answer it, Clara, I said, my voice cool and steady as I stood up and closed the green canvas binder, zipping it shut with a firm, final click. You're not going to talk to her? My dad asked, his hand still resting on my shoulder. Not over the phone, I said, looking out the small window of the office toward the gravel parking lot, where the long shadows of the evening were starting to stretch across the yard. Genevieve Beaufort doesn't do her dirty work over the phone when she's this angry. She's old school Savannah. She wants to look me in the eye when she tells me how common I am. She wants to threaten me in person. I looked down at my watch. It was 5:45. She'll be here within the hour, I said, turning to Clara and my dad. And when she gets here, we are going to be ready. The gravel in the yard outside began to crunch under the tires of a heavy truck pulling in. And I knew the first of our real drivers were coming home from their long runs, parking their rigs for the night, unaware of the storm that was about to break in our front office. The silence that followed the ringing of the landline was heavy, almost physical. For a long moment, the only sound in the tiny office was the steady, rhythmic rattle of the window unit air conditioner, fighting its losing battle against the Georgia humidity. Clara let her hand drop from the receiver, her eyes locked on mine. My dad stood in the doorway, his broad shoulders slightly slumped, but his jaws set like granite. She called back, Clara whispered, her voice barely louder than the hum of the fan. Or she called Julian, and he'll call his daddy's lawyers. Let them call, I said, my voice quiet even. The lawyers can't change the calendar. The temporary injunction expired at 4:30 this afternoon when the clerk stamped the final decree. Right now, legally speaking, Julian Beaufort has as much authority in this company as the stray cat that sleeps under the loading dock. I stood up and walked over to the small, scratched filing cabinet in the corner. I needed to move to let the restless energy in my limbs find a purpose. If you've ever had to hold your breath and play the fool while people who think they're better than you systematically dismantle everything your family built, you know what this moment feels like. You don't feel a sudden rush of adrenaline. You feel a deep, cold focus. It's the feeling of a mechanic finally finding the stripped bolt that's been ruining the engine, knowing exactly which wrench to use to tear it out. I pulled open the bottom drawer, the metal tracks groaning from years of salt air. Inside was a stack of clean, white cardboard boxes, the kind we used to store old logbooks. I lifted one out and set it on the worn linoleum desk. "We need to lock down the physical assets before the sun goes down completely," I said, looking at my dad. "Dad, I want you to go down to the gate. Marcus should be rolling in from his run to Jacksonville any minute now. When he gets here, tell him to park his rig across the main entrance. Leave just enough room for our local drivers to squeeze through, but keep the main gates blocked." My dad nodded, a spark of the old logistics commander returning to his eyes. "You think they'll try to come down here and take the trucks?" "Not the Peterbilts," I said, a dry laugh escaping my throat. Genevieve wouldn't know how to double-clutch a semi-truck if her life depended on it. But Cousin Archibald has a company-owned Ford F250 Super Duty that we've been paying the lease on. And Julian's sister, Lucille, has a brand-new Mercedes SUV registered under our corporate fleet. I've already contacted Low Country Recovery. The repo agents are on their way to Hilton Head and the landings with the master keys. But if any of those 27 try to drive corporate property onto this lot to make a scene, I want them stopped at the gate. "I'm on it," my dad said. He reached out, his thick, calloused thumb gently brushing my cheek. "You're doing good, baby. Your mama is looking down on us right now, and she is smiling." He turned and walked out, his heavy work boots thudding against the plywood floor of the hallway. Through the window, I watched his tall, slightly stooped frame walk out into the amber evening light of the gravel yard. The air outside was turning the color of bruised plums, the Spanish moss on the live oaks at the edge of the property catching the last fiery rays of the Savannah sun. I turned back to Clara. "Let's get the bank on the phone." We didn't call the main customer service line. We called the direct cell phone of Sarah Jenkins, the commercial loan officer at Southern Coastal Bank who had managed Vance Logistics accounts since my dad bought his third truck in 1989. Sarah was a woman who knew the value of a dollar and the value of a promise. She had watched my mother fight her illness, and she had seen the way Julian used to swagger into the branch, demanding cashier's checks for operational expenses with a signature that looked like a toddler's scribble. "Sarah," I said when she answered, my voice dropping into that professional, measured tone I'd used for 20 years of dispatching. "It's Annette Vance. The divorce is final. I'm emailing you the certified copy of the decree and the updated corporate resolution right now." "I've been waiting for your call, Annette," Sarah said, her voice warm but businesslike. "I've got the files open on my screen. I see the resolution revoking Julian's signing authority and removing him from the corporate treasury access. I need you to freeze the secondary payroll account immediately," I said. "The one ending in 4482. That's the account Julian set up for his special projects division. If any automatic drafts or checks hit that account starting tonight, I want them flagged and returned as unauthorized." I heard the rapid click of Sarah's keyboard over the line. "Consider it done. I'm placing a hard freeze on that account right now." "What about the corporate credit cards?" "Every card issued to Julian, Archibald, Lucille, and the rest of the 27, I said. I want them deactivated. If they try to buy a tank of gas, a dinner, or a pack of gum, I want the transaction declined. And Sarah? If any of them call the branch screaming, refer them to Moran Sterling's office. She's representing the corporate interest now." "They're going to scream, Annette," Sarah warned softly. "Genevieve Beaufort has been a depositor here for 40 years. She's already called our branch president twice this afternoon trying to find out why her personal line of credit is linked to your corporate guarantees. Because Julian used our company's receivables as collateral for her personal real estate loans without my dad's signature. I said, my teeth clicking together, which is why we've already filed a formal dispute with your legal department. Genevieve is about to find out that her historic townhouse isn't as secure as she thinks it is. I'll handle the freeze on our end, Sarah said, her voice softening. You take care of your dad, Annette. He's a good man. Thank you, Sarah. I hung up, leaning my hands on the edge of the desk, letting my head hang for a brief moment. The physical exhaustion of the last 2 years was a heavy, dull ache in my lower back, but my mind was running like a finely tuned diesel engine. I know some of you sitting there right now are thinking, Annette, weren't you scared? Weren't you worried about the fallout? About what the neighbors would say in a town where family names are treated like holy scripture? Let me tell you something. When you've sat in a hospital room for 18 months watching the strongest woman you've ever known slowly fade away while your husband is out spending your family's sweat-stained money on tennis lessons and oyster roasts for his relatives, you lose your capacity for fear. You realize that the opinions of people who only love you when your pockets are full don't matter. The only thing that matters is the truth. Annette, Clara said, her hand on her chin as she stared at the computer screen. Look at this. Archibald just tried to use his corporate card at a marine supply store in Hilton Head. Declined. 3 minutes ago. A small, cold smile touched my lips. The first domino. And here, Clara continued, her voice rising with a mixture of awe and excitement. Lucille just tried to charge a $400 catering deposit in downtown Savannah. Declined. They're realizing the well has run dry, I murmured. I walked over to the window that looked out onto the main yard. The gravel was dusty, the smell of diesel exhaust and hot rubber thick in the air as our drivers brought their rigs home. These were men and women who worked in the grueling southern heat. Their shirts stained with sweat and grease, their faces lined with the fatigue of hundreds of miles on the highway. They were the ones who paid for Genevieve's silk scarves and Archibald's fishing boat. They were the ones who had been denied their safety bonuses because Julian had claimed the company was facing a temporary liquidity crisis. A silver Peterbilt, the one my dad had bought back in '98 and refurbished himself, pulled into the yard, its air brakes letting out a loud, satisfying hiss. Marcus, our senior driver, hopped down from the cab. He was a big man with a graying beard and hands the size of dinner plates. He saw my dad walking toward him and immediately stopped, the two of them talking in low tones near the front bumper. My dad pointed toward the main gate, and Marcus nodded, a slow, understanding grin spreading across his weathered face. He climbed back up into the cab, the engine roaring to life again as he began to maneuver the massive truck into position across the gravel entrance, leaving just enough room for a single car to squeeze through if they drove carefully. The trap was set. The legal documents were signed, the bank accounts were frozen, the credit cards were dead, and the physical entrance to our property was secured by 60,000 pounds of American steel. I walked back to my desk and picked up a clean blue and white porcelain mug that my mother had painted years ago. It had a small chip on the rim, but it was my favorite. I poured myself a cup of lukewarm chicory coffee from the pot in the corner, not caring about the taste. I just wanted something warm in my hands. The phone on Clara's desk didn't ring again. The silence was absolute now, save for the low rumble of Marcus's truck idling at the gate. Then, through the window, I saw the headlights. They weren't the yellow, warm headlights of a working man's truck. They were the bright, modern, ice blue LED headlights of a late-model luxury SUV. The vehicle turned off the main county road, its tires crunching aggressively on the gravel as it slowed down, finding its path blocked by Marcus's Peterbilt. The SUV stopped, its high beams illuminating the side of the silver trailer, washing the dirty aluminum in a harsh, white glare. "She's here!" Clara whispered, her hand instinctively going to her throat. I took a slow sip of my coffee, the bitter liquid warm against my tongue, and set the mug down on the green canvas binder. The driver's side door of the luxury SUV flung open, and even from 50 yards away, in the dimming twilight of the Savannah marsh, I could recognize the sharp, elegant silhouette of Genevieve Beaufort. The headlights of the luxury SUV cut through the rising marsh mist, casting long, eerie shadows across our gravel lot. Through the window, I watched Genevieve Beaufort step out of the vehicle. She didn't slam her door. Women like Genevieve didn't slam doors. They closed them with a soft, expensive click that somehow sounded more threatening than a shout. She stood in the gravel for a moment, her high-end Italian leather heels sinking slightly into the stones. Even in the dimming twilight, she looked immaculate, a cream-colored silk blouse, tailored trousers, and that signature ivory silk scarf draped over her shoulders. But as she looked up at Marcus's ancient, rusted Peterbilt blocking her path, I saw her jaw tighten. Her perfect country club composure was beginning to fray at the edges. "She's coming in," Clara whispered, her hand still resting on the landline receiver as if it were a shield. "Annette, she looks like she's ready to spit nails." "Let her," I said, my voice quiet and steady. I took another sip of my lukewarm chicory coffee, the chipped rim of my mother's hand-painted mug rough against my lip. We've spent 15 years letting her dictate the terms of our existence. Tonight, she plays on our court. The front door of the terminal building opened, the rusty hinges letting out a loud, metallic screech that always reminded me of an old gate. The humid night air rushed into the air-conditioned office, carrying the heavy scent of Pluff mud, diesel, and Genevieve's expensive French perfumey, a suffocating blend of jasmine and rose that always made my throat swell. She walked down the narrow wood-paneled hallway, her heels clicking aggressively on the worn linoleum. She didn't knock. She pushed my office door open with the palm of her hand, her eyes instantly locking onto mine. "Annette," she said, her voice carrying that low, honeyed southern drawl that she usually used to patronize waiters and dry cleaner employees. But tonight, there was a sharp, icy edge to it. "I think there has been a rather ridiculous administrative error, and I expect you to correct it immediately." My father stepped into the room behind her, his large frame filling the doorway. He didn't say a word. He just crossed his thick, calloused arms over his chest, his eyes fixed on the woman who had spent the last 3 years treating his life's work like her personal inheritance. "There's no error, Genevieve," I said, keeping my hands flat on the green canvas binder on my desk. "But please come in. Have a seat." She looked at the squeaking vinyl chair Clara had placed for her as if it were covered in grease. She remained standing, drawing herself up to her full height. "I have just received a frantic phone call from Archibald," Genevieve said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming thin and dangerous. "He was at the Hilton Head Marina, attempting to fuel his boat for a charity excursion tomorrow morning, and his corporate card was declined. When he called the office, he was told his employment had been terminated. And then, not 10 minutes ago, my daughter Lucille called me in tears because her caterer was refused payment." She took a step closer to my desk, leaning her manicured hands on the edge. "I don't know what kind of petty, vindictive game you are playing because Julian decided he couldn't live with a woman who has grease under her fingernails. But you will reactivate those accounts this instant. You are interfering with Beaufort family business." I looked at her, really looked at her. I saw the fine lines around her eyes, the tension in her neck, and the desperate, fragile pride that kept her upright. "If you've ever had someone look at you like you are nothing more than a temporary inconvenience, like your entire life's struggle is just a footnote to their comfort, you know the cold, quiet peace that comes over you in that moment. You don't want to scream. You don't want to throw things. You just want to lay the truth out on the table and watch them try to find a way to spin it." "Genevieve," I said, my voice dropping into the same measured, dispatching tone I used when a driver was stuck in a blizzard on I-95. "This isn't a game, and it certainly isn't an error." I opened the green canvas binder. The metal rings clinked in the quiet room. I pulled out the first yellow legal pad, sliding it across the desk toward her. This is the ledger of Archibald's fuel card usage over the last 12 months, I said, pointing to the highlighted rows. $3,000 in diesel last month alone. None of it went into a Vance Logistics vehicle. Your nephew has been using our corporate accounts to run his private charter boat business. That's not regional outreach, Genevieve. That's grand larceny. She didn't even look down at the paper. She kept her eyes locked on mine, her nose tilting upward. Archibald is a Beaufort. His presence in the coastal community is invaluable to this firm's reputation. Julian approved those expenses. Julian didn't have the authority to approve them, I said, my voice remaining calm, almost gentle. And as of 4:30 this afternoon, Julian is no longer an officer of this company. The court finalized our divorce, Genevieve. The temporary injunction that kept us from cleaning house is gone. Your son is out, and so is your family. You common, ungrateful little girl, she hissed, her southern charm completely evaporating, revealing the raw, ugly classism underneath. You think you can just cast us aside? What my husband's family has built this city. We have connections in every bank, every courthouse, and every municipal office in Chatham County. We can tie you up in litigation until this tacky little trucking company is bankrupt. We will ruin you, Annette. I looked up at my dad. He didn't flinch. In fact, a small, knowing smile played at the corner of his mouth. I know some of you sitting at your own kitchen tables right now have faced this exact threat, I said, looking directly at the space between us, speaking to the invisible crowd of women who have been told they aren't smart enough, wealthy enough, or connected enough to stand up to power. You've been told that the system is built for people like Genevieve, and that if you dare to speak up, they will use their money and their names to crush you. But let me tell you something. Names don't pay the light bill, and connections don't mean a thing when the paper trail is signed in ink. I pulled the stapled corporate bylaws from the binder and laid them directly on top of her yellow pad. 10 years ago, when my mother was still alive, we restructured Vance Logistics, I said, my finger tapping the signature page. Section 12, Paragraph 4. Any employment contract, consulting agreement, or corporate lease exceeding $50,000 annually must be signed by both the president, my father, Arthur Van Sand, the chief operating officer, which is me. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. Julian signed all 27 of your family's employment contracts as VP of Business Development, using an administrative proxy we granted him when my mother was dying in hospice. But a proxy for daily operations does not bypass the corporate bylaws. Under Georgia law, every single one of those 27 contracts is void. They were never legal. They never existed. Genevieve's eyes finally flicked down to the document. I watched her scan the page, her face slowly losing its color as she recognized the legal language. The smug, tight-lipped smile she had worn in the courthouse gallery was entirely gone now, replaced by a pale, hollow look of dawning comprehension. And it gets better, I continued, my voice steady and cold. Because those contracts were unauthorized, every single dollar paid to your cousin, your daughter, your tennis coach, and your bridge partners is classified as unauthorized corporate distribution. We aren't just terminating them, Genevieve. Marin Sterling, our corporate counsel, is preparing a civil recovery suit. We are suing you, Julian, and the rest of the 27 for the full return of $2 million in stolen corporate assets. You wouldn't dare, she whispered, her voice shaking now, her hand flying to the silk scarf at her throat as if she were suffocating. The scandal, the social ruin, Julian's father's health. I would, I said, looking her dead in the eye. I watched my mother die in a hospital bed while my father drove night routes to cover her treatments because Julian told us we were in a liquidity crisis. I watched my drivers go without their safety bonuses while your sister bought imported porcelain on our corporate credit cards. I have spent 15 years being your common daughter-in-law, Genevieve. But tonight, I am the chief operating officer of Vance Logistics, and the audit is complete. She stood there, frozen, the silence in the room so thick you could hear the crickets chirping out in the marsh. The high and mighty Genevieve Beaufort, the Queen of Jones Street, had finally run out of words. She looked at me, then at my dad, and finally at Clara, who was watching her with a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. The power had shifted, and she knew it. The technicalities of the law were just the tools. The real victory was the truth, spoken aloud in a small, windowless office that smelled of diesel and cheap coffee, by a woman who had finally found her voice. Genevieve stood there for what felt like an eternity, her manicured fingers still clutching the edge of my desk so hard her knuckles turned the color of chalk. The high and mighty matriarch of Jones Street, a woman who had spent her entire life using her family name as a shield against the realities of the world, was suddenly looking at a legal document that stripped away her armor. "You're bluffing," she whispered, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. "The Beaufort name. We have resources, Annette, my husband's associates. Your husband's associates are currently reviewing their own portfolios, Genevieve," I said, my voice as calm and steady as the hum of the warehouse fans. "Because Sarah Jenkins at Southern Coastal Bank has already flagged the collateral Julian tried to pledge. If you want to spend the next 5 years of your life in a federal courtroom, explaining why your personal real estate ventures were funded by unauthorized corporate guarantees from a trucking firm, be my guest. But I promise you, by the time the discovery process is over, the Beaufort name won't be worth the paper it's printed on." She looked at my father, searching his weathered, lined face for some sliver of the soft-hearted man she had taken advantage of for years. But Arthur Vance just stood there, his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes as hard as the steel frames of his trucks. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. With a sudden, sharp intake of breath, Genevieve turned on her heel. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't make another threat. She just walked down the narrow, wood-paneled hallway, her expensive leather heels clicking a frantic, uneven rhythm on the linoleum. We stood in silence, watching through the office window as she climbed back into her luxury SUV. She backed out of the driveway so quickly, her tires spun in the gravel, throwing up a cloud of gray dust that caught the yellow glare of the yard lights before settling back onto the ground. The silence that followed her departure was thick, but it wasn't heavy anymore. It felt like the air right after a summer thunderstorm has cleared the humidity from the marsh. Clara let out a long, shaky breath and sank back into her desk chair, a massive, tearful smile breaking across her face. "My lord, Annette," I thought my heart was going to jump right out of my chest. "You did good, Clara," I said, walking over and placing a hand on her shoulder. "We all did." The legal battle that followed over the next 3 months wasn't quick, but it was decisive. Marin Sterling, our attorney, handled the Beaufort's lawyers with the clinical precision of a surgeon. When faced with the undeniable paper trail of the 27 ghost employees, including the fuel card statements, the social media posts of promotional dinners, and the complete lack of any actual work product, Julian's legal team folded. They knew they didn't have a leg to stand on. If we went to trial, the details of their financial parasitism would become public record, destroying what little social standing the Beaufort family had left in Savannah. In the end, we reached a structured settlement. It wasn't about complete ruin. It was about restoration and boundaries. Julian signed a modified divorce decree, waiving every single penny of the alimony the court had initially awarded him. He also signed a quitclaim deed, returning the historic townhouse on Jones Street to my father and me. We sold that house 3 weeks later, using the proceeds to completely replenish our corporate reserves and fund the safety. Bonuses that our drivers had been denied for 2 long years. As for the 27 independent consultants, they all signed formal releases, agreeing to walk away quietly without a single cent of severance, in exchange for our agreement not to pursue criminal fraud charges. Archibald had to return the company-leased Ford F-250. and Lucille's luxury SUV was repossessed from her driveway on a sunny Tuesday morning, right in front of her neighbors. If you've ever had to sit at your own kitchen table, staring at a stack of bills and wondering how you're going to make ends meet while the people who hurt you are living high on the hog, let me tell you this: the wheels of justice might grind slowly, but when they finally catch up, the sound of those gears turning is the sweetest music you'll ever hear. Stay patient. Keep your receipts. Watch the numbers. Because the truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. It just needs to wait. 4 months after the divorce was finalized, we held our annual driver appreciation barbecue in the gravel yard of the terminal. The air was cool, the December breeze carrying the scent of hickory smoke from the large iron cooker we had set up near the loading docks. My dad was sitting in a folding chair by the cooker, a paper plate piled high with pulled pork and baked beans resting on his lap. He looked tired, his arthritis still making his movements slow, but the deep, dark shadows that had hung under his eyes since my mother's death were finally gone. He was laughing with Marcus, our senior driver, who was gesturing wildly with a rib in his hand, telling a story about a detour in East Texas. I stood near the edge of the yard, leaning against the fender of my dusty SUV, holding a plastic cup of sweet tea. Clara walked over, her gray hair held back by her familiar plastic claw, holding a small, cream-colored envelope in her hand. "This came in the mail today, Annette," Clara said, handing it to me. It was marked personal. I opened the envelope. Inside was a simple, handwritten note from Julian. There were no apologies, no grand declarations of regret. He just wrote that he had taken a job as a regional sales representative for a national shipping broker in Atlanta. He was living in a rented apartment near the perimeter, far away from the historic squares of Savannah and the country club dock where Archibald's boat used to sit. He wrote, "Asterisk, I suppose you were right about the numbers, Annette. They always add up in the end." Asterisk, I folded the note and slipped it into my pocket. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel a rush of triumph. I just felt a quiet, lukewarm sense of peace. Julian wasn't a monster. He was just a weak man who had been raised to believe that other people's hard work was his birthright. He had learned a hard, expensive lesson about the cost of that belief, and I hoped, for his sake, that he would build something real of his own in Atlanta. I looked back out over the yard where our drivers were laughing, their kids running between the parked Peterbilts, their voices carrying over the low rumble of the marsh. These were the people who built Vance Logistics. This was the legacy my mother and father had started with a single-used dump truck and a dream of a decent life. I know some of you are looking at your own lives right now, feeling the weight of a betrayal that seems too heavy to carry. You might be feeling like the villain in your own family because you've decided to say no to the people who have been draining you dry. You're worried about the gossip, the whispers, the cold looks at the grocery store. But let me tell you what I learned on the humid steps of the Chatham County Courthouse. Peace of mind is a quiet thing, but it is the most valuable asset you will ever own. You cannot buy it, and you cannot lease it. You have to earn it by standing up, setting your boundaries in stone, and refusing to let anyone make you feel small for protecting what is yours. My dad caught my eye from across the yard, raising his red plastic cup in a silent toast. I smiled, raising my sweet tea in return. The sun was setting over the Savannah River, painting the sky in deep shades of gold and violet, the long shadows of our trucks stretching across the gravel like promises kept. We had saved our company, we had protected our people, and we had reclaimed our dignity. Love is a gift, not a line item in a budget. And when you finally find the strength to protect the people who truly love you, you realize that the most important ledger of all isn't the one kept in a corporate binder. It's the one written in the quiet, honest miles of a life well lived.